Around 500 BCE, the vast Persian Empire was a huge threat to the Greeks. Eventually, the Ionian cities to the east revolted against the tyranny of the Persian king Darius. The Athenians stepped in to help and sent ships. And for the next 14 years, the Persians try and take over Athens. They finally do, and they sack the Acropolis. Finally, in 480 BCE, at the Battle of Salamis, they overthrow the Persians, who at that time were under King Xerxes. And this marks a new era for the Greeks. They create the Delian League, which is an alliance with the other city-states that allowed for continued protection against threats from the east, i.e. Persia. Gradually, the Athenians become the most dominant over the city-states, and they call themselves the first among equals. The other city-states had to pay tribute to Athens for protections, and this money went into a treasury that was meant for the collective good. But eventually this money went to the rebuilding of the Acropolis. And although the Athenians held high the ideal of democracy, we should acknowledge that the Acropolis was really paid for by tyranny and an abuse of power, and using the funds that were meant for all for this one purpose. But many of the themes of the Acropolis we see stand for the ideals of all of Greece, which is issues of rationality against irrationality, man versus nature, and order versus chaos. And overall, it stood for the ability of men to shape their world. Pericles emerged as the leader of Athens. He was elected strategio, general of Athens, over 15 times. So he really had popular support. After the sacking of the Acropolis and the defeat of the Persians, the Athenians wanted the Acropolis to stand in ruins as a memorial to the defeat of the Persians. Pericles felt that this was not a good use of the Acropolis. It should be instead rebuilt and needed to look good as the capital of Greece. And so the rebuilding of the Acropolis becomes his priority, and no expense was spared. Here I'm showing you a portrait bust of Pericles, and we can see that he was idealized, he's youthful, he's still wearing his helmet, showing his background as a military leader, but he also is wearing a philosopher's beard, and this in Greek culture is really meant to show the intellect of the person. So he is a balance of all things. He is strong, he is idealized, but he is also an intellect. And he becomes instrumental in rebuilding and beautifying Athens in this period. The Athenian Acropolis had always been a center of civic and religious life. In the Neolithic period, it was a town, and it was the center of the city, and the word Acropolis really means city on a hill, and we can see that it is indeed elevated on a hill. It then becomes a fortress, and we can see that it's that elevation and this kind of cliff drop around the hill is a perfect defensive site for a fortress. And then eventually it becomes the center of religious life, and it becomes the site of important temples. The temples of the Acropolis are dedicated to the honoring of the goddess Athena, who is of course the patron goddess of Athens. And you can see from this view of the Acropolis that although it is dominated by the large temple of the Parthenon, it is really a complex of several temples and an approach that invites a procession from below. Pericles tapped his friend Phidias to be in charge of the rebuilding of the Acropolis. And he was a sculptor So we see that sculpture becomes a huge part of the program of the Acropolis. But he was also in charge of recruiting artists and artisans from all over Athens and the surrounding country to put their skills to use. There were people who objected to this huge project because, of course, it was enormously expensive. This massive project required gold and ivory and exotic wood from all over the city-states. It required more than 22,000 tons of marble that needed to be quarried from a quarry 10 miles away. But there was also popular support because this was a huge boost to the economy and put people to work, gave jobs for the working class. As you can see from this aerial view, as I mentioned, there is a clear approach. You can't approach the top of the Acropolis from anywhere but the staircase that brings you up to the Acropolis. Below, you would start at the Agora, which was also a site that throughout Neolithic times had been a place of many different uses for the Athenians, but at this time was very much a place of civil discourse in which we see markets and bureaucratic buildings as well as some religious sites. But there was a processional approach, a road that would bring you up to the Acropolis. You would have to approach through this gatehouse, which was called the Propylaea. And as you approached, you would pass by this small temple, which was dedicated to Athena Nike. And Athena, as a goddess, kind of had several different avatars, and one of which is Athena Victorious, or Athena Nike. And it's kind of a very appropriate place for a temple dedicated to Athena Nike because it's in a defensive post. This is a place which would have been the first defense against the Persians when they attacked the Acropolis. So you pass by there, you walk through the Propylaea, and then you are on top of the Acropolis where on one side of you is this enormous temple, the Parthenon, dedicated, of course, to Athena, but in this case, Athena Parthenos, who is the virgin goddess. And on the other side is the Erechtheion, which is a temple we'll talk about as well. Here is an artist's rendering of what the complex would have looked like. As I said, when you walk up that processional approach, you walk past the temple of Athena Nike, through the gatehouse, which is the Propylaea, and then on the summit of the Acropolis, you are surrounded by the temple Parthenon on one side and the Erechtheion on the other. Before we go on to talk about the Parthenon specifically, from this viewpoint of this aerial perspective of the Acropolis, I just want you to notice also the contrast between the order of the architecture and the rationality of the Greek orders and the kind of ruggedness of this rocky hill and the cliff sides that drop precipitously down. This is a real statement just in the terms of the siting of this place in which we can see this balance of rationality versus irrationality, order and chaos, and man's control over the environment. The Parthenon was begun in 447 BCE and finished in 338 BCE. You can see that from the approach, there is no clear entrance, so it really invites you to walk around and encircle it. This really communicates and reflects Athenians' mode of worship, which is that worship would happen in a communal way on the outside of the structure. So it probably comes as no surprise that the sculptural program, for the most part, is going to be on the exterior of the building with these metopes. And then we have an interior colonnade that has a further frieze. Inside is a cella, or a room, that would be occupied by a colossal sculpture of Athena Nike. Immediately, you'll recognize that the exterior reflects the Doric order. We have Doric columns in the foot, rest directly on the stylobate. We have very plain columns, and above the columns we have metopes and triglyphs in the frieze. But one thing that's very interesting here is, although we have the Doric order on the exterior, on the interior we have a second set of columns on the east and west side of the temple that are Ionic. Here, these are Ionic columns. And so above those, we have the beginning of a processional frieze. So this would be a continuous frieze, which is what we have in the Ionic order. Why do we have the combination of the Doric and the Ionic here? Remember that the battle against the Persians was an alliance with the Ionic people, and that is what helped the Delian League win. So we have an expression of the strength of alliances, even in the order of the architecture. You'll notice that in the frieze of both the exterior and the interior, we have opportunities for narrative. And each of these are stories that come from history and from myth. We have the Centauromachi, we have a Amazonomachi, we have the Gigantomachi, and the good old-fashioned Sack of Troy. All of these, whether they are centaurs or giants or gods, all of these narratives are metaphors for, of course, the most recent triumph, which was the Greeks over the Persians, and of course, by extension, the Greeks over the barbarians. On the interior, however, we have something very interesting, which is the a continuous frieze that shows the Panathenaic procession. In other words, the procession that would be happening at the present moment of the Athenians coming to the Acropolis to honor the goddess Athena. So we have this very interesting combination of mythological time, historical time, both past and present, and by extension future, because of course this annual procession was to be happening every year in perpetuity. Inside the Parthenon, there would have been a great statue of Athena in front of a reflecting pool. Although she is Athena Parthenos, in other words, the virgin goddess, she is fully armed and shown with Nike, this little winged god. Why? Because it is a reference to the victory over the Persians. This sculpture that I'm showing you is, of course, a recreation. The sculpture of Athena Parthenos no longer exists. In the next few videos, we'll go into detail about the sculptural program and the architecture of the Parthenon.